The Philosopher and the Conqueror, how Aristotle forged the vision of Alexander the Great. In the late summer of 343 BCE, beneath the gentle shade of plane trees and the distant hum of cicadas, Aristotle of Stagira arrived at the Macedonian court. He came at the behest of King Philip II, summoned to tutor the young prince Alexander. The boy was 13, and already rumored to possess a tempest's intensity, a lion's courage, and a mind hungering for knowledge. In the courtyard of Mieza, a quiet retreat chosen for its beauty and serenity, Aristotle would train him not merely in the arts of statecraft or war, but in the subtler and deeper mysteries of philosophy, science, and religion. Over the next few years, within groves and halls perfumed by spring blossoms, the philosopher would shape the mind of the future Alexander the Great, forging intellectual steel that would help the youth navigate a world of gods, men, and the shifting sands of power. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the courtyard at Mieza. Aristotle stood with his back straight, wearing a modest tunic of ochre and a himation draped loosely across his shoulders. He had arrived only yesterday from Stagira, and now found himself in the presence of King Philip II of Macedon, a man of broad shoulders and a gaze so intense one felt it could pierce bronze. "I trust your journey was uneventful, Aristotle," said Philip, folding his arms. He was not a man of many pleasantries, but he had a way of showing respect to those who could serve Macedon. "It was peaceful, my lord," replied Aristotle, inclining his head slightly. "I thank you for the escort. The roads near the border have grown uneasy." Philip grunted, half in acknowledgement and half in frustration. "Aye, much remains unsettled on our frontiers." He paused, scanning the horizon. He often looked away when he spoke of matters that vexed him, as if searching for solutions on distant hills. "But you are here for more pressing matters than the security of our borders. You have come to teach my son." Aristotle nodded. "Indeed, sire, I understand the honor and the responsibility." Philip motioned for Aristotle to walk with him under a pergola adorned with grapevines. The two men strolled through the gardens in silence for a time, the hush broken by the gentle trill of birds and the whisper of a small stream trickling over stones. Finally, Philip spoke. "You knew my father's friend Plato in Athens. You learned at his academy. My agents tell me you are second to none in your command of philosophy and natural sciences. It is said you can classify creatures, speak of the movements of the stars, argue politics, and dissect the beauty of poetry with equal mastery." Aristotle lowered his gaze in humility. "I strive to understand the world, my lord. I cannot claim the greatness of my teacher, Plato, but I shall endeavor to pass on to your son all I know." Philip stopped and turned to face Aristotle. "I do not need a poet's flattery. I need a sculptor of minds. I want you to give Alexander the tools to rule, for he will not inherit a simple legacy. He will inherit a kingdom surrounded by enemies, and he must grow to surpass his father. He must learn politics, strategy, the art of command, the power of rhetoric. But more than these, he must learn wisdom." Aristotle offered a gentle smile. "You ask for much, and yet wisdom is the soil from which all other virtues grow. I shall teach him as best I can. I know the boy is gifted. They say he tamed Bucephalus, a horse no one dared ride. Such spirit is rare." Philip's face softened at the mention of his son's famous deed. He reached out and placed a hand on Aristotle's arm. "Then you know the greatness that lies within him. He has a temper like wildfire, and a curiosity no wall can contain. Guide him, Aristotle. Show him not only how to wield the sword, but also how to wield the mind." Aristotle bowed. "It shall be done." The following day, Aristotle entered the small colonnade where Alexander waited. The boy stood near a marble bench, running his hand over the carved surface. He wore a short chiton and boots laced up to his calves. His reddish-blonde hair caught sunlight in a halo of gold, and his eyes, those eyes, were keen, bright as polished bronze. He stood poised, shoulders squared, as if already a soldier. Aristotle approached quietly. "Alexander, son of Philip." Alexander turned, offering a half-bow that was more reflex than genuine humility. He studied Aristotle with an almost predatory curiosity. "You are the philosopher from Stagira, The one my father spoke of. I am he, and I come at your father's request. Aristotle placed his hands behind his back, his posture calm. He knew that first impressions mattered. The boy was testing him. Alexander glanced around, as if expecting more ceremony. He found only silence and the gentle rustle of leaves. Do you know why my father summoned you? Aristotle nodded. He wishes me to instruct you in philosophy, science, ethics, religion, literature, everything that may shape a king's mind. Alexander's lips twisted into a thoughtful smile. A king's mind or a philosopher's mind? Are they the same? Aristotle raised an eyebrow. A wise question. A philosopher's mind seeks truth. A king's mind must also seek order and prosperity. Yet if a king does not know truth, what use is his rule? He let the question hang. Alexander tilted his head, weighing the response. I have heard the stories of your teacher, Plato, who said that kings should be philosophers. I wonder if that is possible in a world of war and ambition. Aristotle smiled. We shall see. Mieza provided a perfect setting for their lessons. The grove was studded with carved benches and small altars to the Muses, and the air smelled of figs and pine. Other young Macedonian nobles, including Hephaestion, Leonatus, and Ptolemy, would join Alexander in these lessons, though it was clear who the favored pupil was. Aristotle began with the fundamentals. He introduced them to Homer's epics, the Iliad and Odyssey, as the foundation of Hellenic culture and virtue. On a crisp morning, Aristotle led them through a passage of the Iliad, the one where Achilles, enraged by Agamemnon, withdraws from battle. The boys sat in a semicircle, listening to Aristotle's measured voice. Mark well how Achilles' fury leads to conflict and death, said Aristotle, setting down the papyrus. It is not strength alone that wins wars. Achilles was strong, but his anger and pride nearly cost the Achaeans the war. Virtue without reason is blind, like a horse without reins. He paused, letting the silence press upon them, then turned to Alexander. What say you, my prince? What do you learn from Achilles? Alexander rested his elbows on his knees. Achilles was mighty, nearly immortal, yet he was enslaved by his own pride. He forgot the larger goal, the unity of the Achaeans. His glory was personal, not for the polis. He lacked wisdom. Aristotle nodded approvingly. Yes, consider that you too are gifted. You will have strength, armies, and cunning. But if you act as Achilles did, you risk losing sight of the greater good. Hephaestion leaned forward, adding softly, Then a king must guard against pride. He must learn temperance. Aristotle smiled at Hephaestion. Well said. Then he turned back to Alexander. Wisdom is your shield against folly. Remember this. They moved from the epics to philosophy, from the myths of heroes and gods to the structured reasoning Aristotle had refined from Plato's teachings. Under a vine-trellised arbor, Aristotle introduced Alexander to the concept of forms and substances, cause and effect. Everything in nature has a purpose, a telos, Aristotle explained one afternoon. The dappled sunlight fell across his face, accentuating the earnestness of his words. To understand a thing, you must know its causes, the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. Consider a horse, Alexander. What makes a horse a horse? Its flesh and bone, its shape, the act of breeding that gave it life, or the purpose it serves to run and bear riders into battle. Alexander looked down at a carved figure of a horse Aristotle had set before them. All these causes define it, he said slowly. But the final cause, its purpose, seems most telling. A horse is made to run, to serve us, to carry us where we cannot go ourselves as swiftly. Aristotle inclined his head. Yes, and so it is with men, states, and kings. You must know not just what they are, but why they are. That knowledge will guide you in leading them. Alexander frowned thoughtfully. Then what is the final cause of a king? Aristotle's eyes narrowed slightly, impressed by the sharpness of the question. A king's purpose is to foster the good life for his people, to create conditions under which virtue can flourish, not only to defend them with armies, but to guide their souls towards what is noble and just. Alexander nodded, still uncertain. The boy's mind raced, pondering armies and glory, but also now weighed down by the notion of virtue and purpose. They studied science next. Aristotle took the boys to a nearby meadow, where rare flowers and insects thrived. He knelt beside a low shrub, pointing to the leaves and asking the students to describe them. He trapped a grasshopper gently in his hand and showed them the parts of its body, the segments and wings. Observation, he said, is the first step to understanding. My teacher Plato believed in contemplating eternal forms, but I have found that to know the world, we must study its particulars. He held out the grasshopper to Alexander. See how its legs are adapted for leaping, its mandibles for chewing leaves. Nothing is random. Nature arranges each creature for its life. Alexander observed the insect with fascination. He was used to war horses and hunting hounds, but here was a tiny piece of the world he had never thought to examine closely. It's delicate, the boy said quietly, yet it survives among the taller grasses. Everything has its place. Aristotle released the grasshopper, smiling as it vanished into the green. As you study creatures and plants, you will learn patterns. Just as in governing men, you must understand their nature. Observe and learn, Alexander, before you judge or command. Religion and the gods were not neglected. Greece was a world woven from myth, ritual, and divine presence. The boys were not ignorant of Zeus, Hera, Apollo, and Athena. They had sacrificed at altars and prayed before hunts or battles. But Aristotle wanted them to consider religion thoughtfully. One evening, as dusk tinted the sky with a rose-colored veil, Aristotle led Alexander to a small temple in the grove. The rest of the students stayed behind, respecting the privacy of the moment. Inside, an oil lamp flickered, illuminating a statue of Apollo with a serene half-smile. "Your mother, Olympias," Aristotle began softly, "is deeply devout, is she not?" Alexander nodded. "Yes. She keeps serpents in the palace, dedicates them to Dionysus, and performs mysteries. She says the gods guide me, that I am destined for greatness." Aristotle's voice was gentle but steady. "And what do you believe?" Alexander drew a breath, considering his words. "I have felt the presence of something divine. When I ride Bucephalus against the wind, I sense a force, a power beyond me. I respect the gods, the stories my father and mother tell, the oracles, the sacrifices. I cannot rule men without invoking the favor of the gods. They bind us together." Aristotle nodded. "True, religion in our world is more than doctrine. It is the fabric that unites the polis, gives meaning and identity. But remember, the gods also serve as symbols of virtues and lessons. Apollo stands for reason and harmony, Dionysus for ecstasy and change. Whether or not they truly walk among us, their stories guide men's conduct. As king, you must honor them, but also understand them as the people do. They must see in you the piety and reverence they expect." Alexander's gaze drifted over the statue's flawless features. "So I must be both student of the gods and master of men." Aristotle's lips curved into a proud smile. "Well spoken." Over months and then years their lessons deepened. Aristotle challenged Alexander to debates on the organization of the polis, the nature of justice, the ideal conduct of a ruler. He introduced him to history, both Persian and Greek, so the young prince understood the great struggles that had shaped the world he would one day inherit. Together they read Herodotus and Thucydides, comparing the moral lessons of history and seeing the folly of unchecked ambition. On a crisp morning, Alexander paced under the colonnade, exasperated. "But why must I study the Persians' ways? They are our enemies." Aristotle shrugged, calm as ever. "Knowing one's enemy is the first rule of strategy. Moreover, a king who understands foreign customs is better equipped to govern territories far from home. Consider that one day you might rule lands beyond the Hellespont. Would you govern them blindly or with understanding?" Alexander stopped, thoughtful. "Then knowledge is not just about gaining power, but about sustaining it. To be master of many peoples, I must know their hearts." "Exactly," said Aristotle. As Alexander grew older, he physically outmatched his tutor, for the youth trained daily with spear and sword, strengthening limbs already gifted by the gods. But intellectually, Alexander recognized a sparring partner in Aristotle that he would not surpass easily. The philosopher's mind was a labyrinth of knowledge and method, and Alexander eagerly followed him through it, emerging with hard-won insights. The news from the Macedonian court often intruded on their scholarly haven. Messengers arrived with tidings of conquests and rebellions. King Philip expanded his reach, forging alliances and crushing rivals. Alexander's father was shaping the world beyond their quiet grove, and the rumble of distant wars underscored every lesson. One afternoon, Philip himself visited Mieza. He found Aristotle and Alexander engaged in a friendly argument over the merits of Sparta's militaristic society versus Athens's cultural achievements. Athens produced philosophy, drama, democracy, Aristotle insisted. That legacy enriches the human spirit. Alexander countered. But Sparta's single-minded discipline forged unmatched warriors. In a world of conflict, is that not strength? Is it not better to be feared and safe than to be cultured and vulnerable? Aristotle pressed his hands together. A city defined by war alone may endure, but what do its people live for? The noble life is more than mere survival. It is the pursuit of what is good and beautiful. Before Alexander could respond, Philip's laughter filled the colonnade. Ha! I see your lessons are well underway. My son, I trust you are not besting your teacher in debate yet. Alexander's cheeks flushed slightly. He has the advantage of years and learning, the prince said, but I will catch him soon. Philip stepped closer, resting a fatherly hand on Alexander's shoulder. Use this knowledge well. Soon you will not be debating in a grove, but convincing proud city-states to bow to Macedon. You must be eloquent, learned and wise. Consider what Athens and Sparta can teach you, and lead not just with strength but with understanding. Aristotle watched the interplay of father and son. He saw pride in Philip's eyes, and a hint of sadness too, for he knew the king recognized that Alexander's destiny would eclipse his own. The world was turning, and in this prince the hinge of fate might rest. As the seasons turned, Alexander's mind broadened. Aristotle introduced him to logic, the careful structure of argument. They studied syllogisms under the olive trees, making chains of reasoning that led from premise to conclusion. Alexander saw that words and thoughts, like armies, could be marshaled in formation to gain ground in the mind. Hephaestion became Alexander's most loyal companion, often lingering after lessons to debate finer points. The bond between these two youths was unlike any other Aristotle had witnessed. They complemented each other. Alexander's fiery intelligence and Hephaestion's calm steadiness formed a unity that boded well for their future campaigns. Aristotle, sensing the importance of this friendship, encouraged it. "A king needs loyal counsel," he said one evening, as the three of them sat under a starry sky. "The bonds you forge now will support you later, when uncertainty shadows your path." Alexander looked at Hephaestion and nodded. "Yes, he is like another self to me." Hephaestion's eyes shone with quiet devotion. "And you, Alexander, are my guiding star." Aristotle felt a rare warmth at this exchange. The seeds he planted in Alexander's mind would bloom better in good company. A wise king, after all, is never truly alone. Religion again surfaced in their talks. This time Alexander, now older and more confident, questioned the nature of the gods. He had learned from Aristotle that inquiry is not impiety, but a road to understanding. "What if," he ventured one twilight as they lingered near a statue of Athena, "the gods are not as we imagine? Perhaps they are forces, principles, not beings who intervene in human affairs." Aristotle responded carefully. "Many have speculated thus. Some say the gods are the embodiment of cosmic order. Others say they are metaphors created by poets to inspire virtue. Yet the people need these stories. Religion provides comfort and meaning." Alexander frowned. "But do I, as a ruler, deceive them by encouraging beliefs I am not certain of?" Aristotle shook his head. "Not if you seek the truth sincerely. As a king you must uphold traditions that bind the community. It is not deception to honor the gods in ways your people cherish. You can still search inwardly for a deeper understanding. The wise man learns to respect both reason and faith and finds a balance that enriches rather than contradicts." Alexander exhaled slowly, looking to the heavens. Perhaps this is the hardest lesson, to accept uncertainty and still lead with conviction. Aristotle placed a reassuring hand on the prince's shoulder. You are learning, Alexander. That is enough for now. The scent of approaching war thickened in the air as Philip's campaigns intensified. Rumors of a grand Macedonian expedition against Persia began to circulate. The mighty empire that once threatened Greece might now fall to Macedonian steel. In the quiet grove, Alexander learned about Persia's great kings, Cyrus and Darius, and their governance, wealth, and religion, the worship of Ahura Mazda. Aristotle had no illusions. Philip had grand ambitions, and Alexander would be his instrument. But the philosopher hoped to give the boy more than a sword's edge. He wanted to give him the moral compass to wield power justly. One afternoon, Aristotle laid out a map, painted on parchment, showing the known world stretching from Macedon to the Indus. He pointed to Persia. If you go east, you will find not only enemies but wonders. Great cities, new customs, philosophies unlike our own. Consider that conquering them will not only mean taking their lands, but understanding their hearts. Alexander traced the route with his finger, his gaze intense. I will build an empire that unites East and West. I will not be just a conqueror. I will be a bridge between worlds. Aristotle looked at him, startled by the scope of the boy's vision. Then you have learned well. The greatest conquest is not land alone, but the minds and goodwill of those you rule. Alexander nodded, resolved. He stood at a threshold, not yet king, but already dreaming of a world reshaped by his will. The lessons also touched on ethics. Aristotle had been working on his thoughts about the golden mean, the idea that virtue lies between extremes. Under a blooming almond tree, he explained to Alexander and the other youths that courage, for instance, exists between cowardice and recklessness. Alexander listened intently, arms folded. So a king must not be too timid nor too bold. He must balance caution with daring. Aristotle spread his hands. Indeed, each virtue is a balance point between two vices. Too little or too much leads to ruin. If you master this principle, you will guide your actions wisely. Consider pride. Achilles' downfall came from an excess of it. Yet no ruler can be wholly without pride, for he must show confidence. Ptolemy, who often remained quiet, spoke up. How does one know the right balance? Aristotle smiled. Experience, reason, and example. Observe those who lead well and those who fail. Test your own actions and see what results they bring. Alexander tapped his chin. So virtue is not a formula, but a practice. Something I must live rather than just understand. Yes, said Aristotle, pleased. Virtue is a habit forged in the fires of daily life. Time passed, and Alexander grew into a young man of remarkable grace and intellect. He sparred daily with weapons masters and rode Bucephalus into distant fields at dusk. But he always returned to Mieza, to Aristotle's side, to wrestle with ideas that would shape the world. A messenger arrived one morning with grave news. Philip had taken another wife, and discord boiled in the palace. Alexander's position as heir seemed threatened. Rumors swirled through the royal court, gossip that Alexander's half-siblings or even Philip's new bride's family might challenge his succession. Alexander was furious, pacing before Aristotle, fists clenched. My father undermines me. He weds a Macedonian noblewoman, and now the nobles whisper that her child will be purer in blood than I, who have Epirus in my veins through my mother. He halted, eyes fierce. I will not be replaced. Aristotle waited until the boy's outburst subsided. You must not let anger guide your actions. Your father's moves are political. He may want alliances that secure the state. This is not a personal slight, but strategy. Alexander seethed. Then how do I secure my place? Aristotle's eyes narrowed in sympathy and caution. Prove your worth. Display your abilities and learning. Become indispensable to Macedon. The people, the army, and the allies must see in you the qualities of a king. Then no marriage bed will undo you. Alexander inhaled deeply, regaining some composure. I will outshine the doubt. I will show them I am worthy. Aristotle dipped his head, relieved. He knew ambition and resentment could poison the soul. If Alexander overcame these feelings with wisdom, he would be stronger for it. A year before Philip's assassination, as tensions rose, Aristotle sensed his time at Mieza drawing to a close. Alexander was nearly 16, a youth on the cusp of manhood, brimming with confidence and intellect. Soon the prince would step fully into the political and martial arena, leaving the quiet grove behind. Aristotle decided on a final grand lesson, a summation of all he had taught. He summoned Alexander at dawn. The air was fresh, dew still clinging to leaves. Hephaestion and the others lingered at a distance, sensing this was a private moment. Aristotle had placed objects on a stone table, a scroll of the Iliad, a carved figure of Athena, a dried leaf, and a small clay amphora. Alexander approached curiously. "Here lie symbols of what we have studied," Aristotle said. He gestured to each in turn. "The Iliad, the poetry and myths that shape our moral imagination. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, emblematic of the harmony of intellect and might. The leaf, nature's lessons, the understanding of life's diversity and purpose. The amphora, a vessel of civilization, holding wine or oil, the products of human labor and trade." Alexander touched the scroll, recalling countless afternoons dissecting Homer's verses. "These stand for all that you have given me, but what is the final lesson?" Aristotle stepped forward. "That a king, to be truly great, must integrate all these realms. You are not just a warrior or a politician. You are a steward of culture, a defender of reason, a nurturer of prosperity, and a seeker of truth. Your sword will carve out an empire, but your mind and soul must fill it with meaning." Alexander lifted his chin, tears almost forming in his eyes. He understood that Aristotle had given him more than knowledge. He had given him a legacy of thought, a compass for the soul. "I will carry these lessons into the world," he said softly. "I will not forget Mieza or your guidance." Aristotle placed a hand on the prince's shoulder. "I believe you. When you stand on the shores of the Indus or before the walls of Babylon, remember these talks under the trees. Remember that knowledge and virtue guide destiny." Alexander nodded, and for a moment they stood silently, teacher and student, both aware that what they shared was rare and precious. In the months that followed, Philip was murdered, assassinated in the theatre at Aegae. The kingdom, shaken, quickly rallied around Alexander, who took the throne at 20. As the young king consolidated power, Aristotle departed for Athens, returning to the city of learning, where he would found his own school, the Lyceum. They parted with mutual respect and understanding. The news of Alexander's campaigns reached Aristotle in Athens, how he crushed rebellions in Greece, secured the Danube frontier, and then crossed into Asia to challenge the Persian Empire. Rumor said that Alexander carried a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, on every campaign. He founded cities named after himself, spread Hellenic culture, and listened with keen interest to the philosophers and sages he encountered in foreign lands. In the dusty streets of Egypt, Alexander consulted oracles. In Persepolis, he marveled at Persian grandeur. In India, he encountered philosophies unknown to Greeks. Through it all, Aristotle's voice lingered in his mind. Observe, understand, seek the cause and purpose of all things, govern with virtue, respect the gods, and balance power with wisdom. For Aristotle, growing older in Athens, hearing tales of his former pupils' exploits was both gratifying and unsettling. Alexander's ambitions dwarfed all that came before, and his will reshaped the map. Yet Aristotle trusted that the seeds he had planted would bear fruit, not always in gentle ways, but in ways that might outlast empires. After all, the philosopher knew that true immortality lay not just in conquest of land, but in the legacy of ideas, virtues, and knowledge passed from teacher to student and then spread to the ends of the earth. Epilogue. Decades later, long after Alexander's own death, people would remember the conqueror who tamed the world. They would speak of the young king who bowed to no mortal man, yet once sat humbly before a philosopher in a quiet Macedonian grove. They would tell stories of a prince who learned to read Homer, understand nature, debate ethics, and revere the gods. They would say that this education shaped him. giving him a vision not just of power, but of destiny and purpose. And they would remember Aristotle of Stagira, who stood beneath the plane trees of Mieza and forged a mind that would change history.